To begin this exercise, download the Monsters and Maids folder. Inside of this folder, you're going to find a variety of different images that you can pick and choose from to complete this exercise. The images that I want you to choose will be the outlined pictures, and you can choose either a monster or a maid. Also be aware that I'm giving you an example of how you can paint the monster or the maid of your choice, but just know that you don't have to follow these 100% closely. Feel free to play around and do your own particular illustration. The main purpose of this exercise is just to get you to get used to using the paintbrush tool and working in the layers for doing a simple painting within Photoshop. To get started, I want you to select one of the images and let's drag it down into Photoshop, and it'll launch a new Photoshop document the correct size and resolution that we need it to be. The first tool we want to look at will be your paintbrush tool. The paintbrush is at the top right hand corner of your toolbox, and it's just the regular brush tool. With it selected, make sure you're working in normal mode with 100% opacity and flow and a smoothing set to 0%. Also, if you're using your tablet, make sure you can toggle on and off the pressure sensitivity for both the opacity and the size of your brush. Next, let's look and see what brushes we have loaded. If you click on the top left-hand corner of your control panel, this will give you a drop-down and show all of the brushes that are loaded into Photoshop. For this particular exercise, I'm going to start off with the general brushes that should be at the top of your screen. If you open up this folder, you see you've got a variety of soft and hard-edged brushes, and some of them have pressure size and pressure opacity already turned on. I'm going to encourage you to use just the regular soft and round edged brush just so you can get used to setting all of these settings manually for yourself. However, if you want to, you can start to use some of the other pressure sensitivity, but you'll see why I'm choosing these and what I'm doing with these as I start to work with those. Finally, let's make sure you've got these palettes open. I've got my color palette, my swatches palette, and also my layers palette. You can arrange them however you see fit, as long as you can quickly and easily access them so that we can go back and forth to pick and choose our different layers and our different colors. The first thing we want to do is to set up our layers so that it's appropriate for drawing. I'm going to choose a regular brush tool, and let's set it up to have red as my painting color. If I was to paint now, I've just got my background layer selected. It would be painting on top of my background, and that's not what I want. So going back down to my layers, let's create a new layer on top of that, and we'll call this our painting layer. Next, if I started to paint on top of this, you can see that it's in its own separate layer, and so it won't mess up or delete or cover up any of the pixels that are on the actual drawing of my background layer. The problem is I can't see my background layer, so we need to change up the blending mode of our painting layer so that it blends well with the background layer. So with the painting layer selected, click on the layer mode of normal, and let's change it to multiply. Now you can see with multiply, this will allow us to see the color that's on top and the line work that's below it. Additionally, if I ever need to delete away anything that I've done, I can either grab my eraser tool, which looks like a regular eraser. It also acts like a regular brush in that you can select any of the brush settings that are up here. I can then change the size or hardness of my brush and click and drag away. Or a faster way to delete away everything that's on this particular layer is to go up to Select, choose All, and then click the Delete key to delete it away. We can then go back up to Select and deselect that. Now let's look at some of our brush settings. If we choose our paintbrush, in addition to changing up the size of your brush, within this panel you can also change up the hardness of the edge of your brush. Right now I've got a soft brush selected, so when I click and drag, the hardness of that edge is set to 0%, and so the softness of the edge of it is very, very fuzzy. However, if I was to bump the hardness up to something like 100%, it'll give me an edge that looks more like this. Soft edges are really good for blending colors together, whereas hard edges are really good for working in tight details. And so you may be working back and forth between both of those type of settings depending on the method or the kind of outcome that you're looking for. I'm going to select all of this. Let's delete it away. Another good way of blending things is by dropping your opacity and flow. I'm going to bring the hardness down to 0% again to give me a hard edge. And the opacity right now is set to 100%. This means if I click and drag, whatever foreground color I have, in this case it's the red, will give it at 100% opacity for that red, 100% red. However, if I drop my opacity down to something closer to 50%, now when I click and drag, as long as I'm holding down my mouse or my pen, it'll only paint 50% of that full red brightness. If I was to paint over it again, you can see how it will add on 50% more all the way up to 100% on top of that. So if I was to drop my opacity down to something really low, closer to 10 to 20%, very slowly I can build up those colors until I get 100% opacity that I'm looking for. Let's delete that away. Another good way of choosing your opacity is simply by typing the numbers at the top of your keyboard. Going in increments of 10, I can hit 1, 2, and 3 to go up 10, 20, and 30%. I'm going to bring my opacity back up to 100%. Now we can look at flow. Whereas opacity, every time I click and drag around, it would add on the opacity. With flow, think of it a little bit like an airbrush. I'm going to bring this down to about 20%. Now if I click and drag around, it'll automatically blend together the more I go over those particular areas. And so I don't have to click multiple times to build it up. All I have to do is to paint over that area multiple times. Dropping the flow down means I'll flow in there much slower. Bringing the flow up to 100% will go much faster, getting to that 100% opacity. So working between the flow and the opacity is a great way of slowly and easily building up the colors that you want. This is especially helpful if you're working on shadows or if you're trying to blend in a specific area. The other quick way of choosing the flow is by holding down the Shift key and then typing in the number. Shift 1, 2, 3 will give you a flow of 10, 20, and 30%. Of course, hitting 0 will go all the way up to 100%. And then, of course, clicking on the pressure sensitivity for both the size or the opacity will change up the size and opacity based on the pen pressure that you're using. Right now I've got pen pressure for the size selected, so a little bit of pressure gives me a small and a lot of pressure gives me a larger brush, all the way up to the maximum size of the brush that I have selected. Whereas if I turn that one off and turn on opacity, a little bit of pressure gives me a low opacity, all the way up to a lot of opacity for a harder pressure. It's very rare that I'll need both of these turned on, but sometimes I'll use one over the other depending on the kind of style that I need or what I'm trying to accomplish. Of course, with they're turned off, you'll just get 100% of whatever size and opacity that you have selected. The next tool to understand is the Paint Bucket tool. The Paint Bucket is located in the middle of your toolbox. It could be hiding underneath your Gradient tool if you don't see it. But this will allow you to quickly and easily fill in entire areas within a contained boundary. Now, to make sure that boundary is selected, make sure Continuous is checked on and All Layers is also checked on. This way it'll look for all the layers within our document and it'll also stay within continuously that particular color that we have. Also make sure your opacity is selected at 100%. I've got red selected now. If I wanted to quickly and easily fill in her hair with one click, it'll fill in that red color, foreground color, inside of all of that area, only stopping when it reaches the boundary of the black outline of her hair. Now, it didn't get the rest of it, so with one click I can fill that in, and then it'll be simply a matter of filling in all the different spots that I see that pertain to her hair. If you accidentally click away, for instance, if I clicked on the outside, you can see it fills in all of that. Remember, you can Command Z and undo this. Now, the downside to the fill bucket is that it will always fill in something as long as there's not a break in the line. But sometimes when you do drawings, there is a little break and you need to be able to define the boundary. For instance, let's choose a flesh tone, and I want it to be able to fill in her face. With one click, I can fill it all in, but I really don't want the eyes to be filled in. All this doesn't need to be that flesh color. So to work with this one, I'm going to swap over to my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to make my brush much smaller. Excuse me, I'm zooming out. Let's zoom in now. Make my brush much smaller, and I'm going to go ahead and paint in a boundary for that flesh tone. I want it to stop right here. Same way for this eye, I'm going to paint in a boundary for this eye, and also right up here. Do be careful, some of these boundaries are very, very small. But with that now established, I can grab my paint bucket tool, and in one click I can fill in that particular area again, even right up here in this spot. Now if you see that your boundary is slightly off or slightly different, this is where you go back and you grab your brush tool and you clean up any edges that may be necessary. And you fill those colors in. All right. The final concept to understand is working within selections and selected areas. If I go back to my tool panel, using any of the selection tools, so these could be your marquee tools, these could be your lasso tools, or even your magic wand and quick selection tools. Wherever you have a selected area, Photoshop will only allow you to paint within that area. Here's how we can use that to our advantage. If I was to use my circular marquee tool, and just click out a circular area. When I grab my paintbrush tool, I'll swap over to black. Wherever I paint, it will only stay inside of that circular area. So notice if I accidentally go outside of that area, it won't let me click and add on to that. So this is a great way of masking off an area and working just within that particular boundary. Of course, if you go to select and deselect it, then you'll be working like normal and you can paint outside of that area. Let's undo everything. Now you can use this to your advantage whenever you start to add the details such as shadows and highlights to your already existing figure. If I was to choose my Magic Wand tool, Magic Wand allows you to quickly and easily select like colored pixels. So with it selected, make sure Continuous and Sample All Layers is checked on. I can click once on the red area and it selects all of the red within her hair. If I wanted to add on to this selection, I can hold down the Shift key, get a little plus sign next to my cursor. I can then click on all of the red areas and it will easily add on to my selection. When I let go of Shift, it goes back to normal. Now let's choose our paintbrush tool. I'm going to choose a slightly darker red, make my brush slightly larger. Now with this darker red, I can click and drag and add the shadows to her hair, and it stays inside of her hair area simply because that hair is now selected. I can go up to Select and Deselect. You can see that's the results that I get. Same way with working in her face. Choose your Magic Wand tool, click once on the face area. You can then go up to your brush, and let's choose a darker shadow color. And I can click and drag and add on those shadow shapes. Just make sure you've got all the areas selected that are appropriate. For instance, I neglected to get to her forehead up here. So now that I got that, swap back over to our brush. Ooh, a little bit too dark, so I'm going to drop my opacity down and then build up that particular shadow that's there. So for the rest of this exercise, I recommend starting with the paint bucket tool and go ahead and fill in a base color for all different parts of your figure. Keep in mind everything needs to have a color, so choose the colors that are appropriate. Later on you can go back and start to add small details such as lights and shadows and also any other kind of textures that you want. Now with that finished, I can use my selection tool, and I like to use the Magic Wand tool. Again, just make sure you've got Continuous and Sample All Layers checked on. Also, by the way, keep your tolerance relatively low. Around 10 pixels is pretty good. With that selection tool, I can then select the area I want to affect and start adding the details that I want into it. So if I wanted to add, say, some shadows to this top part of her dress, I would click once on each petal. I've got this one selected. Let's add a shadow to that one. Swap over to my brush. We'll get a darker version of that blue. I want to make my brush larger. Again, I've still got a soft edge brush, but I'm going to drop my opacity down to about 40%. I can click and drag and add a shadow to that particular edge. We can do Command D to deselect. Grab your Magic Wand tool again, select another area, swap over to my brush, And I can click and drag and add shadows to that. Just repeat this process over and over again until you get all of the details for your shadows added onto it. Once you've finished adding all of the details and colors that you want to your painting, save this as a Photoshop file. We can go up to File and Save As. Do make sure to add your name at the end of it. There we go. With the Photoshop format, this will give me all of your layers. We'll hit Save and upload that Photoshop file to Moodle for your exercise grade.